Thanks so much for being here for this conversation.
It's my pleasure.
So it has, the film has quite the Hollywood ending for the 1950s. It's not, the novel was a bit different, but, you know, it allows the couple to walk away into the sunset because the wife is actually dead, which doesn't happen in the book. So,
I have to say, for somebody that works in the field, particularly around the opioid epidemic, I have to say that my first thought was that there's just as much possibility that, if not more, that he would go back to the substance because of the nature of his disease. So I think it's really interesting to me watching it, and I know that a lot of my friends in recovery are here. It's definitely an open-ended film.
Mm-hmm. So in preparing for the role, Frank Sinatra actually followed or spent a lot of time with people who were in recovery and who had been addicts and visited rehab hospitals. Could you see that in his performance?
Yeah, I was curious myself if he himself had some trauma in his life, some depth of experience, so I couldn't resist having the opportunity to come here poking around. And he, of course, had a trauma at birth. He was born not breathing. He was a forceps baby, and his whole life was very self-conscious about the scar on his face and whatnot. So had several bouts with depression, several suicide attempts in his life. I suspect that some of his experience was from watching and learning from other people who had that pull to substance use disorder or those that had been addicted or in recovery. But I wonder also if he identified on some level with that pain and that yearning, that not feeling good enough, that needing something to feel better. So there's curiosity in my heart around that. But I'm sure that you know, I work at the university. I'm a professor of social work and also work with undergraduate studies. But we have recently done some interdisciplinary work around substance use disorders. And my colleague in pharmacy, Carlton Erickson, who's emeritus, he himself wanted to study addiction as a brain disease, but before he did that, he spent about 10 years in and out of open 12-step meetings with his closest friend being a person in recovery. And he says that he learned more from that school than he did from his professional education around addiction.
Interesting. Yeah. So what is different since the 1950s in terms of how we look at addiction and recovery? And you know, you do see sort of this dramatized in real time, being locked in the room, and you know, just being kept away from the substance, and that being sort of the hard way out. Can you talk a little bit about the depiction, but also sort of where we are today and in terms and what we've learned since then?
I think that the biggest breakthrough has been the concept of addiction as a brain disease, because we are able to study the brain with brain scans, MRIs, CAT scans. They know exactly where craving exists in the brain. It's a very interesting phenomenon because it exists in the same part of the brain, the most primal part of the brain, or the reptilian part of the brain, with the other instincts for survival. So that desperation that you witness actually contradicts the language of calling it a habit. Many of us have habits, things that we've done habitually, environmentally supported and whatnot. There is definitely a component of that. But for someone with a disrupted pleasure pathway, which is what most of the scientists refer to it as now, we know that there is this deep-seated sensation of needing the substance. The sensation is, I won't survive if I'm not with that substance. And so this sort of captured some of that desperation. I thought about the scene where he's tearing the room up looking for the heroin reminds me a lot of, probably some of you know, Days of Wine and Roses and the greenhouse scene, and that desperation of, I'm going to find it, I need it, I'm going to die without it. So that's the biggest changed that we know, and also treatment has changed. So we used to lock folks up in sanatoriums and hope that they would get well, and most of the doctors in the 1930s and 1940s contended that there was absolutely nothing that they could do, that there was that this tremendous disease of alcoholism and addiction was something that that couldn't be helped until there were Oxford groups and 12-step programs and the discovery that with support from other people, that there was this mechanism to get people through that initial period of craving. The one thing that we also discovered with science is there was this sensation, people would say, you'll feel so much better, and we saw in the movie how there's this depiction of, well, I've kicked it, and I feel I'm better now, and I can get on with my life. But one of the things that we know is that brain disease and the maladjustment, that the craving continues anywhere from between 6 and 18 months typically. So when we tell people you'll feel better when you give up drugs and alcohol, it's really it's not the truth. That there's a tremendous discomfort for the first number of months, sometimes years of abstinence. So, and that's something we know now needs a holding environment for that type of healing. So one of the things that has been an erroneous depiction of the disease is that it is this acute illness that can be treated with a short period of rehabilitation, and then you go back to your life and you're well. And what we know is that this is a chronic disease and needs protracted treatment with lots of mechanisms of intervention. So maybe family intervention. A lot of people need some type of, and 12-step is only one mechanism of support, that a lot of times feeling productive, having a sense of self-efficacy, I'm capable of doing something, feeling productive, that all of those pieces are pieces in the puzzle for long-term recovery.
I mean, it's so interesting that you're bringing up what science has proven over the years, but to the film's credit, a lot of that is in there. You know, the I guess they call him the not the vendor, but the drug dealer who's not a dealer. All the language is confused because he's a card dealer, the drug dealer's I forget what the peddler. Yeah. So the peddler says, you know, I had,
and he uses pusher. He says, "I'll
right,
push for you."
right.
So
and he talks about, but the peddler talks about candy and that being an addiction, and then you know we see Sinatra. You know, equating that, and then this idea that yes, he's not long or far away enough for him to recover. So it's interesting that the film was able to capture that. And why do you think it took so long for science to kind of catch up with what was being observed?
It's a very interesting phenomenon because it's one of the only diseases where it looks like volition, right? Mm-hmm. You see there's substances or there's alcohol, and someone has to take their hand and put their hand on it, or in this case with heroin, actually inject it or have somebody inject it. That feels like, to somebody without that pull, without that brain chemistry, something that one could just say, well, don't do it. Yeah? I mean, there are very few diseases like that. And what we know is that with that degree of desperation, the way that the mind is working is that getting that substance is, until there are tools of recovery that you're familiar with and you can work with, you really are powerless over that first substance to a certain degree. And I loved how the movie showed that while he was moving towards abstinence, while he was locked in that room, there was this attempt to, I'll just stick something in my arm, anything, and you can see that was his brain chemistry gone awry. There was no drug there in that attempt. So I think that science has caught up in some ways with this film. I think it was very prescient. Anyone with a substance use disorder that watches this film, there's an itchiness that you experience during this film. There's a discomfort because of that identification with that that pull towards use.
Does anybody have any questions for Lori or any observations about the film? Yes.
Can I step aside from the question and then step back into the question for a second? Because the one thing that I find really important to convey is coming back to this issue of language. And there are many people nowadays that are saying how we frame addiction and recovery is a big part of the problem and the solution, because so much stigma is attached to this thing. So I would love for you to think about relapse as a person with a substance use disorder coming out of remission. I don't think we think about it that way, because relapse looks like I got weak and returned to this substance out of volition. And again, if it were cancer, for example, we don't say someone relapsed with their disease, because the implication is that it happened to them instead of they did something wrong. So I just want to reframe it so that we're thinking about relapse in that way. And we know nowadays, I work with adolescents in particular. I'm one of the founders of Austin's first sober high school, recovery high school. It's called University High School. We have freshmen to seniors who come who, if they went back to their regular high schools after treatment, have an 80 to 90% chance of relapsing in their first month because of the pull to use, because of the triggers, which are very real. That's not just habit triggers. Those are brain chemistry triggers and also the anticipatory high. There's a lot of these scientific elements that we're aware of now that we weren't then. But one of the things that we know, particularly for young people, is that this coming out of remission and returning to remission is often part of the process itself of coming to the awareness of one's powerlessness and inability to maintain it without support. So one of the things that we do is we try not to shame people in early recovery around that concept of relapse. And I want to speak specific to opioids for a second, because we've had the beautiful gift of 12-step programs since 1935, and for many people, abstinence is the solution. Yes, but one of the things that we know about opioids is that the craving is so intense, and the withdrawal is so nightmarish, and I think was captured very well in the film, that when someone does come out of remission and returns to use and then tries to get back into the abstinence model, a lot of times they internalize that sense that I am a failure. Like, I cannot do this. I'm going to die of this disease. Why do I even try? And I don't feel comfortable in those rooms where everybody's saying, rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. Work harder. Work this program harder. And one of the things that science has provided us with now, which we're really grateful for as well, is the awareness that each case is unique. And some people come with tremendous trauma that they're trying to numb. Not just the pain of the addiction itself, but also pain of their life experience. So one of the things that we know is that care should be individualized, and that sometimes medication-assisted recovery is the best path. So that's tricky, since we're mostly thinking about drug addiction and recovery in terms of abstinence, that there are many people who need methadone or Suboxone or naltrexone as a mechanism to give them the opportunity to connect with the possibilities for their life and looking at it in a different way. It's the self-hatred and the disdain that a person with an active addiction experiences is almost something that can't be described. And a lot of times that warped sense of self runs so deep and so profoundly that a person in early recovery can't even see what other people see about their potential for recovery. So one of the things that we know is that for people in early recovery, or people that are, let's not even call, we're redefining recovery, right? So for somebody with an opioid use disorder, somebody that is a heroin, that has that need for heroin, that if they come to a harm reduction program, that let's say they come to the needle exchange van at 3 in the morning because they don't want dirty needles, they want to exchange their needles. Many of us squirm in our seats when we hear about that. If you don't have a full understanding, there's a part of you that might think of it as enabling, right? That person needs to get well. Why would we give them clean needles so that they can go out and use some more? I've even heard that argument about naloxone. Well, now they can use with an impunity, because if they're using with someone else who's carrying naloxone, then they can just be revived. But I want you to know that I don't know of one person with a heroin use disorder who says, well, now I can just go out and use because my buddy will give me a shot of naloxone if I'm. It's not how somebody with a substance use disorder thinks. So we've rethought this concept of relapse, and it's a fabulous question. Because, of course, the best possible solution is that somebody says, I can't use substances, and is able to go on with a life of abstinence. That is a beautiful thing. It happens for millions of Americans that way. But we've got to start to allow people to define their own recovery. When I was doing some research with adolescents, I was at Garza High School, which is an alternative school of choice, and they had a substance use program. And I was interviewing a particular young person who said, well, I'll be honest with you. Here's how I define my recovery. I'm mostly sober. Now, that sounds like an oxymoron to anybody that's worked in the field, mostly sober. Like, sober tends to mean abstinence. But what he was saying is, I'm off the drugs that are most likely to kill me most quickly. Carlton Erickson also adds that it's a misconception that if you're addicted to one substance, you're addicted to all substances. It's not the way it works. That's another scientific finding. And so we're trying to, with recovery coaches who are peers, along with treatment centers that are more open to this possibility of harm reduction being a mechanism that may be on the road to recovery, or maybe that person's solution, that we're much more compassionate to this dilemma of the brain disease.
And can you just clarify a little bit about that? It seems like that's a fairly new concept, the idea that one substance is not equivalent to another in terms of the way that your brain deals with it.
It's very, very tricky. Here's the dilemma. When my mom was an addictions counselor, and she became an addictions counselor in the 80s, and my mother was abstinent in 12-step programs and died on the verge of 40 years sober, she used to say, a drug is a drug is a drug. That it didn't matter whether it was alcohol or marijuana or cocaine, opioids. If you're a person with a disrupted pleasure pathway, if your brain is broken around this stuff, and she used to talk about it in terms of pickles and cucumbers. She used to say, once you're pickled, you can't go back to being a cucumber, which is an interesting way to put it. She basically would say that you can't use anything safely. She was so rigid about it, she used to say, you ought, as a person in recovery, you ought not even be eating food that was cooked in wine. French food ought to be out for you. And that's one way to look at it, but that was before we had this awareness. Now we know that, and I'm going to be very, very honest with you, it's a very dangerous piece of information for people in early recovery who have become abstinent in 12-step programs, because there isn't one addict or alcoholic who doesn't want to believe that they're the one that can use one substance safely and just give something else up. And I'm going to tell you that looking at track records, it is more common that somebody, even if they weren't using their drug of choice, it lowers their inhibitions such that at that point they say, well, if I can drink this wine and smoke this pot, why the heck aren't I using my favorite cocaine? I'm sure I could keep control of that too. So does that make sense? So that's why I say it's safe enough. I mean, it's safer to choose abstinence. That's because there's no knowing what substances you might be okay with. I know I'm also a cancer survivor. And and I'm also a person with a substance use disorder, and I've had the blessing of for me, being a person in long-term recovery since 1987. It's a long time. I was 22. And I have decided for myself that it doesn't make sense for me to do any experimenting at all, because for me, the substance use was always about oblivion and total numbness, and there was nothing social about it. So I made that choice for myself. But I have to tell you, when I went for my mastectomy and needed to have pain meds, because that was necessary at the time, that wasn't something I craved. Opioids are not my thing. I have no desire for opioids whatsoever, and I'm grateful for that, because my father actually, I was taking care of him in hospice, and there were opioids everywhere, and that wasn't my pull. But knowing that doesn't mean that I'm going to say, oh, well, if I'm uncomfortable, I could use some opioids.
Right.
Does that make sense? So there are complexities to it on every level. I think it is important for somebody to be able to say, I gave up using heroin. I no longer use intravenously. Yes, I drink. Without us judging that, because that might be their truth. Question is in itself the most important part, because we witness it all the time. So we know that, for example, people that have been in prison who have been off for a long time, that if they come out and use the same amount that they had used at the end of their use when they were using, that is what can cause an overdose. So the tolerance is definitely a piece in this. The other piece in this that we can't minimize is that more and more the heroin that's on the streets is mixed with and or sometimes purely fentanyl. So what they're getting their hands on may be different. So it is, again, there are these complexities, but the primary point being that people are at greatest risk when they've given it up for a period of time and they resume use. So it's tolerance is a big piece, and what they're using is a big piece. Not only do they not get it, but family members very often become part of the disease. And you saw Zosh was so desperate for things not to change. Like, I want the old Frankie back. And that's, it was a little, quite dramatized. But we see that sometimes when people get into recovery. Other people are like, I don't know who you are anymore. And, what about the fun person that you were? What about this other talent that you had? We know musicians that need to give up being musicians because that world is so powerful to them, and how much exposure they get to drugs, how many relapse. We just heard the news about Mac Miller this week. I mean, this is happening left and right in our society. I agree with the depths of sadness, and I've devoted most of my life to trying to help other people to understand addiction as a brain disease, because watching it's something that looks like such lunacy, because it is. It's a brain disease. And so we need to have an understanding that it needs treatment. The one other thing that you prompted that I just would want to say is, nowadays, because of stigma, there are many people, and I heard this from the director of Jewish Family Services, who says, I have people that come to me that say, I've been self-medicating for a mental health problem, and that actually many people would rather have the mental health problem, the depression or the manic depression, and be able to go on using, than to acknowledge that that can be the primary problem. It's such a chicken or the egg. So the complexity of looking at dual diagnosis and comorbidity with other illnesses adds a whole nother layer to how difficult it is to understand.
Are people more successful if they don't go right back to the environment that they were in, like what we saw in the film?
as hard as it is for me to say this, because families want to believe that they can be the ones to help, it is absolutely helpful to have somebody be outside the home to recover. And that nowadays we even see for the kids that are at our recovery high school that very often their families are powerless over being helpful. And I'm going to give an example. One of our kids ran into difficulties with substances, and we found ourselves, picking them up late at night when they were at friends' houses and tucking them in and giving them money when they needed it, and all of the things that you're told not to do because you feel so desperate to make them feel better. Does that make sense? So having a setting where somebody says, if you make this choice, this will be the consequence, and actually being able to implement a consequence. I remember the one time that my kid didn't make it home by a curfew and slept on their front porch. That was the last time that happened. But would we as a family would have been capable of keeping that door locked if that was the consequence we had put forward? Probably not. So more and more treatment centers are looking at creating these ecosystems of recovery such that there might be detoxification and then early recovery settings, mid-recovery settings, then halfway houses, three-quarter houses, and then Oxford homes where people are living together in recovery, but they don't need counselors on board, and then maybe at some point being able to reintroduce family. Because it's the instincts, for whatever reason, are often not the healthiest of instincts when you love somebody so desperately. I mean, you saw how hard it was for Molly, yeah? Right?
She was a real hero.
She's a hero. I think it's so powerful to put it that way. I kept thinking about the guilt and the shame. You have to take care of me. You caused this. You have to take care of me. You don't change anything. And you're absolutely right. I mean, if you reread it, you could absolutely imagine that that's all the disease working on him from the inside out. So, great point. Absolutely.
There is this moment that Kim Novak's character, Molly, says that you've turned it all into one big hurt, and then you're treating that. And I wanted you to kind of comment on that. You've been talking about individualized care, and
I'll never forget. My ex-husband had 16 years in recovery and relapsed and wound up dying this past year of recovery. So I'm still trying to keep his memory alive. But he used to describe it, the metaphor that he used to put forward. He used to say that I feel like I'm in a deep pit, and that I start to climb my way out and claw my way out, and I'm getting all that mud under my fingers, and I'm finally starting to see light, and then life comes along and pours water into the pit, and I slip back down, and I feel like I'm drowning again. That sort of perpetual pit filling up with water is how it seems at the time when you're trying again and again to get it right, and life knocks you down, so to speak. But I have to say, so much of that, when she describes it, she says, can't you be like the rest of us? Life hurts. It's hard for all of us. And so I think that in some ways is the hope, because the disease is what's constantly telling somebody in early recovery, you don't deserve this, you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're going to wind up in so much pain you're not going to know what to do, you're going to be alone, you're going to be lost, your dreams will never come true, all those Zosh messages. But when they're around other people who can say, I was exactly where you were, and if you keep this up, you'll get to a point where you're more comfortable than you are right now. You can't see it, you can't imagine it, but you got to trust that my experience of being comfortable in my skin is something that you can reach by virtue of doing these prescribed things.
Thank you all so much for coming out to see the film and for participating in the conversation.
Such a
and
delight.
Thank you so much for giving us your time today.
Let me say one more thing.
Yes.
I know that we've gone a long time, but please please do not hesitate to email me if you're in a situation with somebody that you know that is struggling and you don't know where to send them. We're still working on filling in the gaps in our continuum of care, so to speak. And so if you know somebody that is struggling with a substance use disorder and you don't know what to say or where to go or what to do, please, my email is LORIKAY, Lori K, at mail.utexas.edu. I'm the only Lori who's a social worker in the school social work, so if you Google it, it'll come up. But I would love to connect you and anyone else that might need some assistance or support or suggestions, get connected with resources because they're out there.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Lori. Thanks. Thanks for coming.